So thank you to Rolf and to the conference organizers for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I was thinking, after Rolf told me that I was opening for Carl Wyman, I was thinking about Albert Brooks. Do people know Albert Brooks, who's a comedian? He talked about opening for AC/DC once and how people were like throwing stuff at him. So, you know, so I'm like the Albert Brooks of your talk. So you have probably noticed I am not in a STEM discipline, and you probably wonder what I am doing here. And what I'm doing here has to do something with this cartoon, which you may have seen. So, have people seen this cartoon? Yeah, it's well known. So I am not a faculty member in a STEM discipline, but I am a faculty member, a researcher and a teacher who works with the quintessential conundrum that this slide presents every day. And that's these questions. What does learning mean? And what does it mean to students? What does it mean to parents, to faculty, to community members, to others? How can we design for learning? And what do we as faculty members need to know to understand and to make the leap from implementation, design to reality? So as the director of UC Santa Barbara's Center for Innovative Teaching, Research, and Learning, or CITRAL, I've worked with faculty from across our campus and with many, many others around the country to think through these questions and to come up with some concrete answers and practices that I'm going to talk a little bit about today in the brief time I have with you. So mostly today, I'm going to focus on a framework that's emerged from the work that I've done. The framework helps students access expertise in STEM disciplines and, of course, other disciplines as well. But you are STEM faculty, and so I will stick to STEM disciplines. So the framework is rooted in the answer to the first question I raised for you, what learning means. So I find the summary of learning that I've distilled here from the National Academy of Sciences especially compelling. Learning is a dynamic process that requires coordination of cognitive, cultural, and social systems within the individual. It happens over time. It requires practice, feedback, and reinforcement. It happens in specific places. The ability to learn involves, in part, understanding how to learn in specific places and understanding how to transfer both how understanding learning occurs and elements associated with learning to other sites. And then expertise involves bringing all of this together. So I realize that this is fairly abstract, but to show you what I mean, I'm going to use some descriptions of successful learners from UCSB STEM colleagues who've participated in a year-long faculty development seminar that I teach here on campus. So these come from their responses to questions about successful learners in their courses. So first, here are 3 faculty describing how to learn, or what it looks like to be a good learner in specific places. You can see abandoned memorization, they know how to derive answers, they ask questions that indicate that they're thinking about mechanisms. So here, they're discussing some activities that contribute to this ability to learn. So they can describe their roadblocks, they can think about what they need to do to get beyond those roadblocks. They find ways to study that can help them connect ideas, and they know how to ask for help when they need it. So here's a faculty member pulling all of this together, saying, the more I think about it, the more I realize that students are trying to balance these 3 types of learning. They're learning the subject, they're learning how to learn, and they're learning to be comfortable in their own skin. So if we take all of these ideas from faculty in STEM disciplines and go back to that idea of, here in step 2, we can say that it's really not a miracle. It's a process that involves the things in that box. Applying information to derive answers, describing and working through roadblocks, connecting concepts, understanding what to learn and how to learn it in this place, which is different from other places, and being comfortable in their own identities for learners. So, not so much a miracle, but a bunch of things that we need to think about through our teaching. So, my own research, along with extensive research across STEM disciplines and work done in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, suggests that we do this through a framework for learning that takes into account the elements on this slide. And I'm going to talk through each piece of this in a little bit of detail. So the first piece is this idea of disciplinary knowledge. So we all exist in disciplines, and students are learning things about our disciplines in our courses. And this is probably the most familiar of these 3 elements. So the work that happens in DBER and other kinds of discipline-based education research, of course, has been very important for helping make the case that disciplinary knowledge is really constituted of two practices: ways of thinking and practicing, and threshold concepts. So ways of thinking and practicing involve thinking about how experts think about and operate within disciplines. It means, for example, learning what kinds of questions get asked in disciplines, what kind of data or evidence are collected in disciplines, how that's analyzed or interpreted, and how what is learned is represented. As a writing teacher, I hear a lot about that last piece, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So, learning that disciplines have ways of thinking and practicing, and then learning how to identify those ways of thinking and practicing is crucial for learners to understand and begin to perform expertise. So, another element associated with disciplinary knowledge are threshold concepts. These are the concepts that lie even deeper than ways of thinking and practicing, the epistemological and ontological orientations that are essential for people to understand why the ways of thinking and practicing function as they do. Research into threshold concepts, or TCs for short, has been going on for about 15 years. Faculty across a range of disciplines have used threshold concepts as a strategy for naming foundational elements within disciplines, using them to frame learning experiences as pathways to access expertise. So your colleagues in STEM disciplines have named some threshold concepts, and these are especially for novice learners just entering disciplines. So you can see the idea that traits don't increase in frequency, only the genetic recipes for traits are transmitted to the next generation, so only genetic recipes become more or less common. Another, the mathematical answer to a problem means something and the problem isn't solved until you figure out what it is. Or the form of biomolecules defines their function. And again, these are threshold concepts that faculty have identified for novice learners. Threshold concepts become more sophisticated the more the learners become sophisticated themselves. But they are characteristics associated with ideas that we see as experts, and we need to help learners see in order to access expertise within our discipline. As we think about threshold concepts, they have some common characteristics that we also need to keep in mind. And this is going to move us to the next element of the framework, and that is learning knowledge. So threshold concepts are bounded. They are threshold concepts in a discipline, in a place. Some disciplines share some threshold concepts, but threshold concepts are never shared by all disciplines, because if they were, they wouldn't be threshold concepts. They exist in specific places. They are also troublesome. They often jumble things up for learners. They lead learners to see things differently. They butt up against existing knowledge or inert knowledge or knowledge that is cross purposes, and so it gets very confusing for people. They are liminal. So if you think of a liminal space, a doorway, there are things that people go through, but they don't go through them in a linear way. They kind of a two-step forward, one-step back kind of thing, as people really wrestle with these different kinds of ideas. That's why the metaphor of a threshold, something that's crossed, is used here. So it takes time for learners to go through that threshold. And they're integrative. So once people see a threshold concept in one place, they start to see them in other places all over the place. And they're usually irreversible. And I'm going to come back to both of these ideas in a moment. So one of the challenges of threshold concepts is that they change the way that people think. And when you change the way people think, they start seeing them everywhere, but it can be very disconcerting. You can't stop seeing them in all the places. And sometimes it's very out of control. So I like the slide from the X-Men, when, you know, the guy with the mutant with the eye thing, he can't control his eye thing initially. He has to find a way to control it. So that's one of the problems of threshold concepts. They lead to different kinds of thinking that you have to then also learn how to sort of rein in. So all of this brings me to the second element of the framework, and that is learning knowledge. In order to help students access expertise in STEM disciplines or anywhere else, we need to know something about how people learn. That's critical for making expertise accessible. Everyone is a learner, and learning never happens once and for all. This idea, of course, can also be a threshold concept for faculty, because it can change the ways that we think about our roles and our relationships with students. It can also help with this idea that helping learners understand that they will learn how to sort of rein in their superpowers, their minor superpowers that come with understanding threshold concepts differently. So finally, the third element of this framework for learning has to do with representational knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that comes into play when we think about making disciplines accessible, and it has to do with how knowledge is represented in our disciplines. Mostly, that is, how you expect things to be written. As a writing teacher, as I've said, I hear a lot about how you expect things to be written, and mostly I hear from people when they're like, why can't my students write this thing the way I want them to? Because, you know, I get to hear about those kinds of things. But writing is not just about textual production. It's really the top of a well that includes disciplinary knowledge, that is, ways of thinking and practicing in some degree of participation in threshold concepts. All of these are reflected in how you think, all of us think about good writing, and what characteristics we all associate with goodness when we think about writing. Though some of your STEM colleagues might initially argue otherwise, these characteristics are not universal, nor neutral, nor natural. There is no one kind of good writing or some kind of basic good writing that all other writing is built on. So this is also a threshold concept, but it's one from my own discipline of writing studies. And as non-experts, you might think, that can't be true. That is troublesome to me. But I am telling you, it is true. And if it's troublesome knowledge, then you can have the same kind of experience that your students have when they encounter troublesome knowledge in your courses. But anyway, so representational knowledge also has to do with the identities that our students bring to our courses and the ways in which they represent their learning and their knowledge. So this is, of course, a huge idea that's at the core of inclusion, at the core of your meeting as well, and really important as we think about making our disciplines accessible to all kinds of students. Ideas, commitments, passions, and cultures. So we have to think about how all of these things intersect in our pedagogical knowledge, the final element of the framework. So when we think about all these things and bring them together, understanding the intersections between disciplinary knowledge, learning knowledge, representational knowledge, and pedagogical knowledge, we can then start to think about planning courses, activities, assignments, and day-to-day interactions that can help us get to not being more explicit here in step 2, but thinking about what's included in step 2 and building it into what we do every day. That's it. Thank you so much.
Anybody have a question?
Or a point of troublesome knowledge that you want to say, that cannot be the case.
Okay, I have a question, and I always have the same question. Okay, I got this great theory. What do I do tomorrow in my lecture to implement? How do I get from all that to what I do tomorrow in front of my class? Because that seems like, for me, the big challenge. Get from A to Z.
Okay. So I hope that you're not teaching tomorrow because it's Saturday, so I'd like to first say that. And you'll be here tomorrow, so.
I'll be here tomorrow.
So if you're thinking about Monday, for instance, you could think, what is the thing that I most want students to learn Monday in my big lecture class? Why do I want students to learn that? How is it connected to something that they might be interested in? And what can I do to learn more about that? So there are many ways you could do this in your big lecture class. You could, for instance, depends what you wanted to do. You could think about, let's take the first piece. What do I want students to learn about in this class, and why do I want them to learn it? That's something you could write down for yourself. And then you could say to students, today we are learning about X. X is really, really important in biology, in genetics. I've worked with Rolf a little bit. Because it helps us understand that genetics is this thing that genetics is, that genetic recipes, blah, 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 blah. That's, I don't have the slide in front of me. So. Meiosis, which I can spell correctly. So that's one thing you could do. It's a long inside joke. Don't worry about it. Yes. So a second thing you could do if you wanted to connect, if you wanted to learn more about how students' take on what they were thinking about this thing is one of my favorite pedagogical tools, as those who have worked with me know, index cards. You could, for instance, even in a big lecture class, hand out index cards and say to people, for 2 minutes, write about what you know about meiosis. And then you could have your TAs collect those at the end of class, flip through them, or you can collect them yourself, and you can say, oh my gosh, people have some fundamental misconceptions about meiosis. I need to change the way I'm teaching about it. I need to say, oh my gosh, you know what? You said this, but really it's this. You can do the same thing with clickers in your class. So there are connections you can make to identities. There's all kinds of things you can do. So, okay.